Alan Robson, champion of the North.
I am a sexy bitch.
Now, over the years, people have said to have heard a noise from the other side, letting us know that someone close to us is going to die. Sometimes it's just 3 taps to a window, 3 knocks on a wall. Have you heard anything like that? Because if you lived around South Shields in the 1840s, you would know Jack the Hammer. He was a traveller who picked up manual labour as he found it. He'd carry out jobs such as carpentry, repairing pots and pans, and although everyone felt comfortable to have him around, he never really managed to gather any friends around him. He lived in a part of South Shields that's now known as the Nook, and remained almost a hermit in his own house. He never answered a knock at his front door, merely stared down from his tatty net curtains. A tall, blondish man with sagging shoulders and a huge beak-like nose, grimacing at anyone that dared to bother him. People were so often rebuffed that they simply stopped calling on him, and neighbours had never heard a sound from him, even when he was at home for long periods. When in his 50s, he suffered a bout of flu and he remained in bed, tried to sleep it out of him. And all that happened was that he became weaker and weaker, eventually dying from the lack of nourishment. His neighbours were not aware that he died, and the body began to decay in the rocking chair that he died in. Eventually, though, a pungent stream of mixed bodily fluids began to seep down through the floorboards onto the couple that lived below them. They were eating lunch when the dripping began, dropping into their soup and onto their lap. At first they thought it was condensation, but it built up to be a fair old stream, stinking out the lower flat too. On investigating, they discovered the man almost mummified. He was covered in cobwebs and sat there palely as they shrieked in horror. He was carried out of the house in that rocking chair, covered with a sheet, and taken away for burial on the back of a cart. In due course, the house was sold and nothing untoward was reported. However, many of the South Shields people claimed regularly to still see the shape of that stooping man at around 6 p.m, walking along the Nook. Some said that he appeared on the riverside during times of thunderstorms and gales as a sign that someone was about to be lost at sea. Other tales tell of how he hammers out a warning of the impending death on the wall of any house occupied by a man who goes to sea. In 1941, Mrs. Margaret Brown heard a tremendous hammering sound on the side of her house in South Shields. 2 days later, she received a letter saying that her son had lost his life aboard the HMS Hood, sunk by the Bismarck, when only a handful of the 1,421 crew managed to survive. In 1982, Mr. Roger Douglas of Tynemouth was staying with his mate Paul Somerville in South Shields. He was woken by a loud hammering on the side of the house and immediately looked out of the window. As the hammering continued, there was no one there. The following Saturday, Paul received a letter from an old person's home to say that his mother had died. Have you had that knocking? So let's dance to another part of the Northeast that's got a good story to tell. In the early 1700s, when Gateshead was very much Newcastle's poor relation, times were hard, and only those with money ever prevailed. And one such man was Charles Henderson, who used to buy and sell goods from both Scotland and the south, selling them at a huge profit to anybody that he could. He created an early form of car boot sale, taking his goods on a horse and cart to homes and villages as far away as Durham, Stanley, South Shields and Hexham. Within a year he was wealthy. Within 5 years he was rich. Henderson's Gallowers, horses, were renowned. People believing that they were getting huge bargains. Now, admittedly, the things he sold were only available in the big cities. So to find fine fabrics, delicate ornaments, luxury food items in a back lane in a small village was bound to create interest. The richer Henderson became, the more he delegated the work to younger men, all quite poor and very keen to earn any kind of living. By 1755, Henderson was in his late 30s, rich, yet still unfulfilled. So he took himself a bride. Now, her name was never known. Some say he bought the young girl from her father for a sum of 5 shillings. Henderson's close friends were introduced to a staggeringly attractive brunette, whom he called Sophie. She never left his house on Windmill Hill, just out of the centre of Gateshead, overlooking the River Tyne. Her only visitor was the old tinker who had provided her, who claimed to be keeping check on his daughter's progress. Within a year, she was pregnant, and Charles Henderson was thrilled. He would have an heir, and all of his hard work could become a family concern. Everything was going for him. He had started providing coal carts and coach services. His Gallowers were still pouring profit in his direction, and overtures were made for him to go into politics. And then, in November 1756, the Duke of Newcastle resigned as Prime Minister, and the groundswell of northern opinion was that Charles Henderson should put himself forward. And yet, this he refused to do, claiming, "This war with France will ruin many men, but not Charles Henderson." And William Pitt became Secretary of State and gathered other northern ministers to face the French threat. Charles Henderson was very much his own man, though, and despite it being totally against tradition, he attended the birth of his son. The delivery had been difficult, and on seeing the child, Henderson reeled back in horror. The infant's face was horribly deformed. Storming out of the house, he ran along the street crying out, "God has cursed me with a devil for a son." He was found by friends sitting in an inn on the corner of what's now Charles Street, where he was trying to drown his sorrows. He then sobbed uncontrollably into the arms of an old woman. Some say he refused to return home for almost a month. But when he did, his demeanour was very different from that of the loving man he once was. He became an ill-tempered brute with his servants, hurling abuse at them and behaving contemptuously towards his wife Sophie. His son was named George after the composer Handel, but Henderson refused to call him that